Welcome, weary traveler, to a journey through the distant past. As you settle in for a night's repose, let us transport you to a time long ago, an age of kings and castles, of chivalry and cruelty. This is the medieval era, a world far removed from our own, yet one that has shaped the course of history in profound ways. Before we begin our tale, I invite you to pause for a moment and share in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. It's a simple pleasure, but one that connects us across the miles and hours. If you enjoy these quiet excursions into the annals of history, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a bedtime story. Now, make yourself comfortable. Dear listener, dim the lights, fluff your pillow, and let your cares drift away as we embark on a journey to a distant time and place. Breathe deeply and let the worries of the modern world fade into the mist of history. Tonight, our story takes us to medieval Europe, a land of great beauty and great brutality. It was a time of soaring cathedrals and squalid hovels, of courtly love and cruel punishments. In this age, justice was swift and often merciless, with little regard for the rights of the accused. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was still centuries away, and the methods used to extract confessions were grim indeed. But before we delve into the darker chapters of medieval history, let us first set the scene. Imagine a world lit only by fire, where the flickering glow of torches and candles cast long shadows on stone walls. A world where the clang of swords and the thunder of hoofbeats are everyday sounds, where life is cheap, and death is always close at hand. In this world, the social order was rigidly defined, with the nobility at the top and the peasantry at the bottom. The church wielded immense power, both spiritual and temporal, and to defy its edicts was to risk not only earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. It was a world of absolutes, where right and wrong were starkly defined, and where the wages of sin were all too often paid in blood. Against this backdrop, the mechanisms of justice took on a particularly brutal cast. Prisons, as we know them today, did not exist. Instead, the accused were held in dank dungeons, often in chains, until their fate was decided. Trials, when they occurred at all, were often little more than a formality, with the outcome predetermined by the whims of the powerful. And the punishments, they were as varied as they were cruel, ranging from the merely humiliating to the utterly horrific. In the coming hours, we'll explore some of the most notorious methods of medieval discipline, from the stocks and pillory to the rack and the stake. But fear not, gentle listener, ours is a journey of the mind, not the body. We'll walk through these dark chapters of history together, safe in the knowledge that they are long past. So let your mind drift back through the centuries to a world very different from our own. A harsher world to be sure, but one that nonetheless shaped the contours of the present day. As we begin our first tale, imagine a bustling market square in a medieval town. The sun is high overhead, glinting off the weathered stones of the buildings that surround the square. Hawkers cry their wares, their voices mingling with the bleating of goats and the clucking of chickens. And there, in the center of the square, stands a grim wooden structure, the pillory. A man is locked into the device, his head and hands protruding through the holes in the rough-hewn boards. His face is beet red with humiliation and anger, as a jeering crowd pelts him with rotten vegetables and dung. This is his punishment for petty theft, a few hours of public shame and degradation. The pillory and its cousin, the stocks, were a common sight in medieval towns and villages. They were used to punish a wide range of offenses, from stealing and public drunkenness to more serious crimes like blasphemy and sedition. The goal was not only to inflict physical discomfort, but to expose the offender to the scorn and mockery of his neighbors. Imagine the hapless thief in our market square, his pride and dignity stripped away as he endures the taunts and insults of the crowd. The stench of the refuse thrown at him mingles with the sweat and grime of his unwashed body, and the summer sun beats down mercilessly on his unprotected face and neck. Yet, as uncomfortable as a few hours in the pillory might be, it was far from the worst fate that could befall a criminal in medieval times. Indeed, Public humiliation was often seen as a lenient punishment reserved for minor offenses and first-time offenders. For those who ran afoul of the law more seriously or repeatedly, a harsher form of public shaming awaited: branding. In this brutal practice, a red-hot iron was used to sear a permanent mark into the flesh of the condemned, usually on the face, hand, or chest. The mark was a visible sign of the person's crimes, one that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Consider the tale of a young woman named Agnes, convicted of adultery in 14th century England. As punishment for her sin, she was sentenced to be branded on the cheek with the letter A. The iron was heated until it glowed cherry red, then pressed firmly against her flesh, sizzling and smoking as it seared the mark into her skin. The pain must have been excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the shame and ostracism that Agnes would endure for the rest of her days. In a close-knit medieval community, such a visible mark of dishonor was a virtual death sentence, condemning her to a life of poverty and isolation. As the screams of the branded adulteress echo in your mind, let us leave the market square behind and venture deeper into the heart of medieval justice. Our next stop is a place of darkness and dread, where the cries of the condemned mingle with the creak of rusty hinges and the drip of water on stone. We are entering the dungeon, a staple of every medieval castle and keep. These subterranean chambers were more than just prisons. They were places of torment, where the unfortunate souls who had fallen foul of their betters were subjected to unspeakable agonies in the name of justice, or more often, vengeance. Picture a narrow, winding staircase descending deep beneath the earth. The air grows colder and damper with every step until at last you emerge into a cavernous space lit only by the guttering flame of a single torch. The walls are damp and slimy with mold, and the floor is strewn with rotting straw and the bones of long-dead prisoners. And there, in the flickering half-light, you see them, the instruments of torture, arrayed like a hellish orchestra, waiting to play a symphony of pain. There are racks and wheels, iron maidens, and thumbscrews, each designed to inflict the maximum amount of suffering on the fragile human form. One of the most feared of these devices was the rack, a wooden frame equipped with rollers and ratchets that could stretch a person's body to the breaking point, literally. The victim's wrists and ankles would be fastened to the rollers, and then the torturer would turn the handles, slowly and inexorably pulling the limbs in opposite directions. Imagine the agony of feeling your joints pop and your muscles scream as your body is stretched beyond its limits. Imagine the sickening sound of tendons snapping and bones cracking under the relentless pressure. And imagine the chilling realization that your tormentors can keep going, ratcheting up the tension until your body is torn asunder. Such was the fate of countless unfortunate souls in the dungeons of medieval Europe. One such victim was a man named Thomas, arrested on suspicion of treason against his king. Thomas was a minor nobleman, accused of plotting to overthrow the monarch, a charge he vehemently denied. But his protestations of innocence fell on deaf ears. Thomas was dragged down to the castle dungeon, stripped of his finery, and thrown roughly onto the rack. As the torturers turned the handles and his limbs began to stretch, Thomas screamed out his innocence, begging for mercy. But there was no mercy to be found in that dark and terrible place. The torturer kept turning, and Thomas's screams turned to shrieks of agony as his shoulders popped out of their sockets and his joints began to separate. In the end, he confessed to anything and everything his tormentors wanted to hear, desperate to end the unimaginable pain. Thomas's fate was sealed by his confession, extracted under the most brutal of circumstances. His body was then quartered and displayed on the city walls as a warning to others who might dare to defy the king. As horrible as the rack was, it was far from the only instrument of torment in the medieval torturer's arsenal. Another particularly gruesome device was the strappado, a kind of reverse hanging that put an excruciating strain on the victim's arms and shoulders. In this torture, the victim's hands were tied behind their back, and then they were hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. The sudden jerk as they were lifted off the ground was enough to dislocate the shoulders, causing intense pain and making it nearly impossible to breathe. But the strappado was more than just a way to inflict pain. It was also used as a method of interrogation. As the victim dangled in agony, their tormentors would bombard them with questions, demanding confessions or information. The combination of pain and suffocation often proved too much to bear, and many a prisoner broke under the strain, babbling out whatever their interrogators wanted to hear. One particularly chilling account of the strappado comes from the memoirs of a 14th century Italian soldier named Giovanni. Captured by his enemies and accused of spying, Giovanni was subjected to repeated rounds of the strappado, each more agonizing than the last. In his own words, Giovanni describes the sensation of being hoisted into the air, his arms wrenched behind him at an impossible angle. He writes of the searing pain in his shoulders, the feeling of his muscles tearing and his bones grinding against each other. He speaks of the panic that set in as he struggled to breathe, his chest compressed by the weight of his own body. Through it all, Giovanni's captives hurled questions at him, demanding to know the location of his army's camp and the plans of his commanding officers. And though he held out as long as he could, in the end, the pain was too much to bear. With a choking sob, Giovanni betrayed his comrades, telling his tormentors everything they wanted to know. For his treachery, Giovanni was spared the worst of the punishments that awaited captured spies, but the memory of his ordeal in the strappado haunted him for the rest of his days. A reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the fragility of the human will as the night wears on and your eyelids begin to droop. Let us turn from the grim specter of torture to the final irrevocable punishment, death. In the medieval world, executions were a common sight, meted out for crimes ranging from theft and heresy to treason and murder. One of the most common methods of execution was also one of the simplest, beheading. Reserved primarily for nobles and those of high rank, beheading was seen as a relatively quick and merciful way to die, especially compared to some of the more gruesome alternatives. But even beheading could be botched, as the tragic tale of Mary, Queen of Scots, attests. Condemned to death for plotting against her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England, Mary faced her fate with regal composure, even making a joke as she laid her head on the block. "I have never had such grooms before to make me unready," she quipped, referring to the men who had helped her remove her outer garments. But Mary's composure was shattered when the executioner's first blow missed her neck entirely, striking the back of her head instead. Stunned and bleeding, Mary nevertheless remained conscious as the executioner readied himself for a second blow. This time, the axe found its mark, but only partially, becoming lodged in the Queen's neck. It took a third blow to finally sever Mary's head from her body, ending her life in a grisly and ignominious fashion. For those of lower rank, hanging was the usual method of execution. Crowds would gather to watch as the condemned were led to the gallows, their hands bound and their necks encircled by rough hemp rope. The executioner would place the noose around their neck, positioning the knot just so, and then, with a sharp tug, send them plummeting through the trapdoor to their death. In theory, a properly carried out hanging was supposed to result in a quick death by broken neck. But all too often, things did not go according to plan. Ropes could break, knots could slip, and instead of a swift end, the condemned would be left to strangle slowly, their bodies jerking and twitching in a grotesque dance of death. And then there were the truly horrific methods of execution, reserved for the worst of the worst, the heretics, the traitors, and the depraved. One such punishment was pressing, a slow and agonizing way to die that involved placing heavy stones on the victim's chest until they suffocated or their ribs collapsed. This was the fate of Margaret Clitheroe, a Catholic woman living in Elizabethan England when practicing Catholicism was forbidden. Margaret was arrested for harboring Catholic priests in her home, a crime that carried the death penalty, but Margaret refused to plead guilty or not guilty to the charges, knowing that doing so would implicate her children and servants in her crime. Instead, she remained silent, even as the judge ordered her to be pressed to death. The method of Margaret's execution was particularly cruel. She was stripped naked and laid on the ground, a sharp stone placed beneath her back. Then a door was placed on top of her, and heavy stones were piled on top of it, one by one, until the weight crushed the life from her body. Through it all, Margaret remained silent, even as the stones ground into her flesh and her bones began to crack. Her last words, uttered as the weight of the stones bore down upon her, were a prayer. "Jesus, have mercy on me." Margaret's story is a tragic one, but it is also a testament to the power of faith and the endurance of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. And as we continue our journey through the dark annals of medieval punishment, we will encounter many more such tales of bravery and resilience in the face of cruelty and despair. But for now, dear listener, let us take a moment to rest and reflect. The hour is late, and the darkness presses in around us, heavy with the weight of centuries past. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to the grim dungeons and blood-soaked scaffolds of the medieval world, secure in the knowledge that those days are long gone and that the sun will rise on a brighter, more just tomorrow. And when you wake, remember the tales we have told and the lessons they hold for us still. For though the world has changed much since the days of racks and iron maidens, the human capacity for cruelty and courage remains the same. It is up to us, in our own time, to choose which path we will follow, the path of brutality and fear, or the path of compassion and hope. But for now, dear listener, rest. Let the soft embrace of slumber enfold you, and dream of a world where justice is tempered with mercy, and where the light of reason shines bright against the darkness of ignorance and fear. Good night and pleasant dreams. Let us now turn to some of the most notorious executions in medieval history, those that aim to prolong the victim's agony as long as possible before finally granting them the mercy of death. Perhaps the most iconic of these is burning at the stake. The image of a condemned heretic or witch tied to a wooden post, consumed by hungry flames, has been seared into the collective imagination through countless depictions in art, literature, and film. But the grim reality was even worse than anything celluloid could conjure. The convicted prisoner would be led out to the town square, where a pyre had been erected, bundles of dry firewood stacked high with a sturdy stake driven into the center. The victim's hands were bound behind them, and they were tied securely to the post, so there could be no hope of escape. Imagine the scene. A jeering crowd gathered to watch the spectacle, their faces flickering red and orange in the firelight. The wood is set alight, and the kindling quickly catches, sending tendrils of black smoke curling into the evening sky. The fire licks higher, crackling and spitting, until it fully envelops the helpless figure at its heart. Depending on the direction of the wind and the moisture in the wood, death could be mercifully quick, smoke inhalation rendering the victim unconscious before the flames truly began their terrible work. More often, though, it was an agonizingly protracted affair, a slow roasting, flesh blackening, and peeling away to expose the raw muscle beneath. One cannot help but shudder to imagine the sheer horror and pain endured by the likes of Joan of Arc, the young French warrior woman burned for heresy in 1431, or the 20 Anabaptists executed at the stake in Salzburg in 1528. Even the most stoic prisoner could not help but scream as the hungry flames consumed them. And yet, as awful as death by burning was, it was not the most prolonged or inventive form of execution dreamt up by the cruel minds of the Middle Ages. That dubious honor may well belong to the breaking wheel. A thick wagon wheel would be repurposed into an instrument of unimaginable brutality. The condemned would be spread-eagled on the ground, limbs extended, and the heavy wooden wheel placed on top of them. Then the executioner would methodically smash the victim's arms, legs, shoulders, and hips with a massive iron hammer, shattering the bones into splinters. This was no swift, clinical breaking. Each shattered joint would be carefully avoided to ensure the prisoner remained conscious throughout their ordeal. The aim was to utterly pulverize the limbs while keeping the vital organs intact, prolonging the agony for as long as possible. Once every bone had been systematically crushed to gravel, the mangled body would be woven through the spokes of the wheel and hoisted up on a tall pole, where it would remain on public display. Sometimes the executioner would deliver a fatal coup de grace to the chest, the so-called blow of mercy. More often, though, the broken thing that had once been human would be left to the mercy of the elements and the carrion birds. By some accounts, it could take days for them to succumb to blood loss, shock, and dehydration under the burning sun. Imagine the sight of ragged crows perching on that shattered ribcage, picking at the jellied eyes and lolling tongue. One of the most detailed accounts we have of a medieval wheel execution comes from 1589. A notorious gang leader named Chrisman Ganapatenga was captured after years of banditry, broken on the wheel in the town square of Bedburg, Germany. His ghastly remains were mounted on a pole along a major road as a grim warning to other would-be highwaymen. Such public executions served as a form of dark theater in medieval times, a reminder of the price to pay for crossing those in power. But not every felon was granted the twisted mercy of a public send-off. For some, death would come far from the eyes of the crowd, but no less gruesomely. Deep in the bowels of the castle dungeon, a cauldron bubbles over a roaring fire. Foul-smelling steam wafts up from its churning depths. A stripped prisoner, hands bound, is led to the edge by grim-faced torturers. Perhaps he shudders in the dank chill. Perhaps he whimpers a last desperate plea for clemency. It will avail him not. With rough hands, he is grasped and lifted over the lip of that terrible vat. Its contents are not water, but molten ley, boiling oil, or even burning pitch. He has only a moment to draw a final breath before he is plunged down into the scalding soup and held under, thrashing and writhing. The searing agony is unimaginable as the boiling liquid closes over him, forcing its way into eyes, nostrils, mouth, sizzling through hair and skin. Blisters erupt instantly, flesh sloughing off in pale strips to float on the surface. Trapped screams bubble up, unheard by any except the hardened executioners. Death is not instantaneous. Even now it takes long minutes before the jerking and twitching ceases, before the prisoner's nerves are seared away and their brain finally boils in its skull. Only when the corpse is utterly still do the torturers draw it out with long metal hooks, unrecognizable, steam rising from the ruined ruin. While not as common as burning or breaking, boiling alive was a fate reserved for criminals, counterfeiters, and coin forgers in much of Europe. King Henry VIII introduced the practice to England in 1531, proclaiming it the penalty for murder by poison after a recent spate of suspicious aristocratic deaths. It is difficult to fathom the sheer depths of cruelty and sadism plumbed by the medieval mind in devising such punishments. But perhaps no method of execution quite exemplifies the dark ingenuity and ruthless brutality of the age as that inflicted upon the most hated and notorious traitors: hanging, drawing, and quartering. To our modern ears, it sounds almost absurd in its Baroque excess, an execution so elaborate and convoluted it defies belief. Yet this ritual butchery was enshrined in English law from the 13th century all the way up until 1867. The condemned man would first be tied to a hurdle or wooden frame and drawn by horse to the site of execution, usually a major crossroads or public square for maximum visibility. He was then hanged by the neck, but cut down and revived before the fatal asphyxiation could occur. Thus began an ordeal of such grotesque and unthinkable savagery, it is difficult to conceive of the minds that birthed it. The half-strangled traitor was stripped naked and splayed out before the bloodthirsty crowd. The executioner then took up a sharp blade and slit open his belly, reaching in to pull out yards of slippery intestine and steaming viscera. Contemporary accounts differ as to whether the entrails were then burned before the victim's fading eyes or simply tossed into a waiting bucket. Some even claim the executioner was expected to take a bite of the prisoner's quivering heart, still hot from his breast, though this may just be folk legend. The reality is scarcely less shocking, for even now, with guts unspooled and glistening ropes, the traitor still clung to the ragged edge of life. The final step was to hack the body into 4 pieces, literally to quarter it. Legs and arms were severed with axe or sword, then the dripping remains were lifted high for all to see. The head and quarters will be mounted above the city gates or sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom as a grim reminder of the king's power and reach. Picked clean by crows and withered by the elements, they might remain on display for months or even years afterwards. Can you imagine a death more cruel, more viscerally, intimately agonizing? Among the most famous to suffer this fate was William Wallace, the Scottish knight and leader of a rebellion against English rule immortalized in the film Braveheart. Captured and convicted of treason in 1305, Wallace was stripped naked and dragged through the streets of London at the heels of a horse. He was then hanged, drawn, and quartered, with his head dipped in tar and displayed on London Bridge, and his limbs sent to the four corners of the country as a warning against insurrection. While the depiction of his execution in Braveheart was mercifully brief, the real Wallace's ordeal likely stretched out for most of a day, every bit of it racked with unimaginable pain. That he was able to stoically endure such prolonged and inventive torment is astonishing. And yet, as we've seen, Wallace's grisly fate was not unique. Throughout the medieval period, untold numbers suffered similar agonies, whether in town squares at the hand of kings or in lonely dungeons under fell lords. The vicious ingenuity employed in these cruel and unusual punishments is chilling to contemplate. Perhaps it speaks to some dark recess of the human imagination, a morbid fascination with suffering and death that found its ultimate expression in these theatrically ghastly displays of power and brutality. How else to explain such a prodigious investment of effort and creativity in devising newer and more agonizing ways to bid farewell to life? And yet, from our vantage point across the centuries, there is something almost comically absurd about the medieval approach to execution. As if in their zeal to inflict the ultimate penalty, they lost sight of the essential fact of mortality, that all lives, whether taken swiftly or sadistically, end the same. The headsman's axe and the torturer's pincers alike deliver their victims to the same dark door. No degree of agony can alter that fundamental truth. In a sense, those who died quickly and cleanly under the sword or at the end of a rope were fortunate. Their suffering was brief. Their ultimate fate no different than those who perished on the wheel or in the flames. And so we come to the end of our grim accounting of medieval cruelty. These barbaric practices may seem remote to us now, artifacts of a darker age when life was cheaper and power expressed itself through spectacle and savagery. Yet it behooves us to remember that the human capacity for cruelty and violence is far from extinct. The specific techniques may have changed, but the underlying impulses that animated the medieval torturer are still with us, in war zones and interrogation rooms, and dark places where the strong prey upon the weak. If there is a lesson to be drawn from these blood-soaked pages of history, perhaps it is this, that we must be ever vigilant against our own worst impulses and work to build a society where such wanton cruelty is consigned to the past. A world where justice is tempered by mercy, and where we need not look over our shoulders in fear of the sword or the stake. It is a noble goal, if perhaps an elusive one. But as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of that better world and resolve to do our small part in making it a reality. Let the grim specters of the breaking wheel and the boiling cauldron fade into the mist of history, and let us embrace a future where every life is cherished and none need live in fear of such horrors. For even the most hardened medieval executioner was once a child who dreamed of a gentler world. Perhaps in honoring that innocent yearning, we can finally lay the ghosts of their victims to rest. Build a society worthy of their memory, a society where cruelty is the exception, not the rule, and where justice is tempered by wisdom and compassion. It's a beautiful thought to fall asleep to, isn't it? That as we slumber, the world turns slowly towards the light, that with each generation, we move further from the shadow of the dungeon and the pyre and closer to a world where every life is sacred. So let us bid good night to the specters of history, secure in the knowledge that their suffering was not in vain, that by remembering their fates, we honor their lives and recommit ourselves to building a world where such horrors are but a fading nightmare, banished by the dawning of a brighter day. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of a kinder, gentler world to come. As we've seen, the medieval period was an era of harsh justice and brutal punishments. Public humiliation, torture, and gruesome executions were all too common, striking fear into the hearts of would-be criminals and the general populace alike. One notorious method of execution that combined slow, agonizing death with public spectacle was being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This punishment was reserved for the most serious crime, high treason against the king. The appalling process began with the condemned being tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged by a horse to the place of execution, often over rough cobblestones that would leave them bruised and bloodied before they even reached the gallows. Once there, the victim would be hanged by the neck but cut down while still alive. Then the real brutality began. The executioner would slice open their abdomen and cut out their entrails and genitals, tossing them into a fire. The crowd would watch in morbid fascination as the prisoners' organs burned and they slowly died from shock and blood loss. But it wasn't over yet. Finally, their body would be cut into quarters, chopped apart with an axe. The headquarters would often be sent to various parts of the country to be displayed as a warning against treason. Few who suffered this atrocious fate are as famous as William Wallace, the Scottish rebel leader portrayed by Mel Gibson in the film Braveheart. Wallace was a thorn in the side of English rule, leading a resistance against their occupation of Scotland in the late 13th century. After waging guerrilla warfare for years, Wallace was finally captured and brought to London to face the wrath of King Edward I, defiant to the end. Wallace refused to swear fealty to the English king and submit to his authority over Scotland. For this, he was condemned as a traitor to be hanged, drawn, and quartered in August 1305. Wallace was dragged through the streets of London to the Elms at Smithfield. There, he was hanged but cut down while still breathing. As he lay dazed, his abdomen was sliced open and his entrails pulled out before his eyes. They were burned in a fire as Wallace supposedly uttered his last words. "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." With his intestines smoldering, Wallace finally expired. His body was then hacked into 4 pieces. His preserved head was impaled on a spike and displayed at London Bridge, while his limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth as a warning to other Scots. It was a horrific end for a man who had fought so fiercely for Scotland's independence. Wallace's gory execution may have made him a martyr, but it succeeded in snuffing out further Scottish rebellion for a time. However, the brutality of his death, even by medieval standards, reveals the true cruelty of the era's justice system. In an age before more humane capital punishment methods like the guillotine, being hanged, drawn, and quartered was perhaps the most agonizing, degrading way to die. As the 14th century dawned, such savagery would gradually decline in favor of swifter executions. Hanging until dead became the default over the prolonged suffering of drawing and quartering. This shift reflected a subtle change in attitudes, a recognition that a speedy death was punishment enough without the need for additional torment and mutilation. Nevertheless, the medieval period will always be remembered as a time of harsh, pitiless justice. Most punishments were designed not just to sentence the criminal, but to make a public example of them. Whether it was languishing in the stocks, screaming under torture, or being disemboweled before a bloodthirsty crowd, those who ran afoul of the law faced fates far worse than any modern prisoner. While the brutality of the Middle Ages may make us shudder today, it's important to understand the context of the time. Life was often nasty, brutish, and short for medieval commoners. Violence and death were omnipresent realities. The cruelty of the justice system reflected the harshness of society as a whole. In some ways, the grisliest punishments were a means of maintaining law and order in a chaotic, cutthroat world. Still, we can be grateful that justice has evolved to be more fair and humane over the centuries since medieval times. No longer do petty criminals risk having their hands chopped off or being boiled alive for their transgressions. The gallows and chopping block have been consigned to the history books in much of the world. Punishments today aim to be proportionate to the crime, not wildly excessive demonstrations of state power and cruelty. So, while learning about the worst tortures and executions of the Middle Ages can be morbidly fascinating, it also reminds us of how far we've progressed. The next time you hear about a criminal getting a comparatively lenient sentence, remember that once upon a time, they might have been publicly eviscerated and torn limb from limb instead. Whatever other challenges the modern justice system faces, we can appreciate that it is a far cry from the merciless brutality of medieval times. As you drift off to sleep, take comfort in knowing that you live in a gentler age, where horrendous fates like being hanged, drawn, and quartered or confined to the history books and to dark bedtime tales like these. The ghastly specters of the torturer and executioner have largely been laid to rest, and we can all sleep a little sounder for it. So rest well and dream of a world that, for all its flaws, is kinder and more just in the distant past. Good night. As the blazing flames consumed her, the young maiden's agonized shrieks pierced the night air. Smoke stung the eyes of onlookers as it billowed into the starry sky. Though Joan of Arc's end was horrific, her legacy would long outlive the charred embers of the pyre. In the centuries that followed, she will be heralded as a French heroine and ultimately canonized as a saint. Her indomitable spirit could never be extinguished. The breaking wheel was another gruesome means of execution, reserved for the most despised criminals. The condemned would be stretched out upon a large wagon wheel, limbs spread and tied along the spokes. With slow, methodical swings, the executioner would shatter the victim's bones with a heavy iron cudgel. The awful crunching of pulverized limbs, anguished wails rent the air. After the dreadful deed was done, the mangled bodies were often left tied to the wheel and hoisted up on a tall pole, displayed as a grim warning to other would-be malefactors. Crows would peck at the flesh of these wretches as they expired in slow agony under the merciless sun. One can only imagine the baleful stares of their lifeless eyes, silently cautioning passers-by against the steep cost of wickedness. Among the most vicious of execution methods was being boiled alive. The accused, frequently coin forgers or poisoners, would be submerged in a great cauldron of scalding water, oil, or even molten lead in some cases. As one might expect, the shrieks of these ill-fated souls were said to be almost unbearable to witness. In 1542, Margaret Davy, a servant in England, met such a macabre demise. She was convicted of fatally poisoning a man named John Burrell, her master. For this treacherous act, the sentence was to be boiled to death at Smithfield. As she thrashed and howled in the bubbling vat, arguably the most atrocious and demeaning of all execution methods was hanging, drawing, and quartering. This unholy trinity of capital punishment was reserved for the high crime of treason against the crown. The process was essentially a prolonged ritual of butchery, designed to inflict the maximum amount of suffering and shame. The accused traitor would first be hauled to the gallows by a hurdle or wooden panel, often upside down, as jeering crowds pelted them with rotten fruit and manure. A noose would then be tightened around their neck, but not so much as to mercifully break it. They'd be hoisted up to slowly strangle, but cut down before sweet death could claim them. What followed next? System was a veritable abattoir of horrors. The condemned would be disemboweled alive, their entrails yanked out and tossed into a fire. The executioner would then hack the body into 4 pieces with an axe. Often the head would be dipped in tar to preserve it, then mounted on a spike as a warning to other potential traitors. The remaining severe quarters of flesh might be sent to the far corners of the kingdom as a grisly display of the sovereign's wrath. Perhaps the most famous recipient of this brutal punishment was Scottish knight William Wallace. Braveheart, as he was known, led a bloody rebellion against English rule in the late 13th century. After his capture, Wallace was condemned to be hanged drawn and quartered for high treason against King Edward I. According to contemporary accounts, his genitals were cut off and burned before his eyes. His belly was then sliced open, and his intestines and heart torn out. As a final indignity, Wallace's decapitated head was set on London Bridge, while his limbs were displayed in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth as a dire warning to other would-be agitators. Though his mortal form was desecrated, William Wallace's fierce Scottish pride has lived on for generations. From flaming pyres to bubbling cauldrons, medieval executions were a theater of cruelty. These harrowing punishments, to our modern sensibilities, showcase the savagery of that era's justice system. And yet, for centuries, the meting out of such vicious sentences was a widely accepted facet of civilized society. Rulers used these ghastly public spectacles to assert their power, to deter crime, and to quell dissent among their subjects. We've come a long way since those dark days when a merciful end was not a right but an expensive privilege. Today, The notion of death by torture, of having one's limbs pulverized and entrails ripped out before a cheering crowd, seems not just macabre but unthinkable. How fortunate are we to live in more enlightened times, when human dignity is an inalienable truth and justice, though still imperfect, strives for impartiality and clemency. And yet, as we drift off to sleep, perhaps we might spare a thought for those poor wretches of yesteryear, the broken, the burned, the boiled, and the butchered. Though their suffering was immense, they were no less human than we who slumber peacefully in the here and now. In our dreams, let us grant them the mercy and grace that their own era so cruelly denied them. Let us remember always the hard-won humanity we now cherish and the barbarism we blessedly left behind. Good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be gentle and just, for though the arc of history is long, it bends ever towards kindness and light. In that comforting thought, let us find our rest. Sleep well until the tomorrow comes. As the gruesome spectacle of William Wallace's execution fades into history, we turn now to consider the broader tapestry of medieval justice. These ghastly punishments, as horrific as they seem to modern sensibilities, were all too commonplace in an age when brutality was the norm and human life was often held in little regard. For the ruling classes of medieval Europe, torture and execution served as both a means of maintaining order and a form of grim entertainment. Noble lords and ladies would gather to watch the suffering of the condemned, sipping wine and gossiping as if attending a sporting event. The elaborate rituals of public execution, with processions through town squares and staged displays of agony, functioned as a kind of grisly theater for the masses. But not all victims of medieval justice were common criminals or political dissidents. In an era of religious fervor and superstition, accusations of heresy and witchcraft ran rampant across Europe. The flames of the Inquisition, blazed as alleged practitioners of the dark arts, were rounded up and subjected to brutal interrogation. One of the most infamous cases was that of the Knights Templar, a powerful Catholic military order that fell from grace in spectacular fashion in 1307. King Philip IV of France, deeply indebted to the wealthy Templars, ordered the arrest of their leaders on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and homosexuality. Under torture, many of the knights confessed to spitting on the cross and worshiping a demonic idol named Baphomet. The Templars' Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, initially admitted to these charges after being stretched on the rack, but later recanted his confession. Enraged, King Philip had him slow-roasted over a fire in front of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. As the flames consumed his flesh, de Molay reportedly cried out a curse on the king and Pope Clement V, summoning them to face divine judgment within a year. Eerily, both men would be dead before the year was out. The grim fate of the Templars highlights the entanglement of politics, religion, and sadism that characterized much of medieval justice. In an age of absolute monarchs and powerful clergy, charges of treason and heresy were often used as a pretext to eliminate rivals and seize assets. The machinery of torture and execution became a tool for cementing the power of the ruling elites. Yet, even as we recoil at the cruelty of these practices, it's important to recognize the historical context in which they arose. Life in the Middle Ages was often brutish and short, with violence and suffering an inescapable reality for much of the population. In a world beset by war, famine, and plague, the harsh punishments meted out by the authorities may have seemed a necessary bulwark against chaos and anarchy. Moreover, concepts of individual rights and due process were still centuries away from being enshrined in law. The idea that every person accused of a crime deserved a fair trial and freedom from torture would have seemed utterly foreign to the medieval mind. Justice was swift, merciless, and often arbitrary, with the whims of lords and bishops carrying the force of law. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and Enlightenment, however, attitudes began to shift. Thinkers like Voltaire and Beccaria argued for a more humane and rational approach to justice, one that respected the inherent dignity of the individual. Slowly but surely, the worst excesses of medieval punishment began to fade into history. Today, we look back on the torture chambers and execution squares of the Middle Ages with a sense of horror and revulsion. And yet, the legacy of those dark times is still with us in many ways. The use of torture as an instrument of state power persisted well into the modern era, from the dungeons of totalitarian regimes to the waterboarding of terror suspects in the 21st century. Even in nominally democratic societies, the machinery of justice can still be wielded as a weapon against the powerless and marginalized. The disproportionate incarceration and capital punishment of racial minorities, the abuse of prisoners in sprawling jail complexes, the denial of due process to enemy combatants, all echo the cruel logic of the medieval world. As we drift off to sleep, let us reflect on these uncomfortable truths and resolve to build a future animated by mercy, compassion, and human rights. For only by confronting the darkness of our past can we hope to forge a brighter dawn. The noble dream of a society governed by justice rather than brutality is one that still eludes us, but it is a dream worth fighting for, now and in all the ages to come. So let us bid good night to the haunted specters of the Middle Ages, secure in the knowledge that their ghostly chains need not bind us forever. In the soft embrace of slumber, we can imagine a world where cruelty is banished and every human life is cherished as sacred. A world where the only confinement is the cozy confines of our bedchambers, and the only sentence is a long and restful night's repose. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of better days to come. For though the arc of history is long, it bends ever towards justice. And the dawn will break anew each morning, washing away the blood and tears of yesteryear. In this great turning of the ages, you too have a role to play, if only to bear witness, to remember, and to hope. Good night, and may your dreams be gentle. As we've seen, the breaking wheel was a particularly grim and gruesome medieval execution method, reserved for the most hated criminals. The condemned will be tied spread eagle to a large wooden wagon wheel, their limbs stretched out along the spokes. The executioner would then use a heavy iron hammer or bar to methodically smash the victim's bones, starting with the ankles and wrists and working inward. Each sickening crunch of splintering bone would be accompanied by the agonized screams of the condemned echoing through the town square. Shock and blood loss mercifully brought unconsciousness for some, while others endured the excruciating ordeal to the bitter end. With limbs shattered, the broken bodies were woven through the spokes of the wheel and hoisted up on a tall pole, left on grotesque display as a warning to other would-be criminals. One of the most famous cases of this macabre practice was the execution of Peter Stump in 1589. Stump was a German farmer accused of being a serial killer and werewolf who preyed on the villages of Bedburg. Under torture, he confessed to murdering and cannibalizing 14 children, including his own son, as well as practicing black magic and consorting with a succubus. His execution was as brutal as his alleged crimes. Flesh was torn from his body with red-hot pincers before he was strapped to a breaking wheel. Stump's limbs were systematically pulverized, but he remained conscious throughout, wailing in agony until an executioner finally beheaded him with a merciful stroke of the axe. His mangled corpse was burned at the stake along with his daughter and mistress, who were deemed accomplices in his sorcery. While modern scholars question the legitimacy of Stump's confessions and the fairness of his trial, his ghastly fate upon the breaking wheel became an enduring part of werewolf lore and German folklore. His grisly demise stood as a vivid example of the cruel ingenuity of medieval executions. But even the breaking wheel paled in comparison to perhaps the most viscerally horrific execution method of the Middle Ages: boiling alive. The condemned was immersed in a large cauldron of water, oil, tar, or even molten ley and slowly cooked to death over an open fire. The liquid would gradually scald and blister the skin, sloughing it from the flesh as the victim writhed and shrieked, the gruesome stench of boiling human fat filling the air. As with being burned at the stake, the torturous execution could drag on for an agonizingly long time, depending on the temperature of the liquid and how high above it the victim was suspended. Some perished quickly from shock, while others lingered in unspeakable suffering for up to 2 hours before finally succumbing. In England, boiling to death was a rare but recorded punishment for poisoners and counterfeiters from the 12th through 16th centuries. One of the earliest documented cases was from 1222, when a man was boiled alive for poisoning a well. During the reign of King Henry III, a cook convicted of poisoning the household of the Bishop of Rochester met the same grisly fate by boiling in 1532. Perhaps the most infamous case was that of Richard Roos, the cook for the household of the Bishop of Rochester in 1532. Roos was convicted of high treason for attempting to poison the bishop and his guests by adding a white powdery substance to a pot of porridge. Although his motive was unclear, and the poison may have been accidental, one of the bishop's servants died and others fell violently ill. By the standards of the time, his crime of treasonous poisoning warranted extraordinary punishment. Roos was sentenced to be boiled to death without benefit of clergy. Chronicles describe how he was stripped naked, suspended by his waist with ropes over a scalding cauldron, and slowly lowered in. His agonized screams filled the air, skin sloughing off in gruesome sheets until he finally expired in the bubbling stew of his own making. The public spectacle of Roos boiled alive was said to have drawn a large, ghoulishly enthusiastic crowd to Smithfield that day. But it also marked the last time a criminal was boiled to death in England. The cruel practice was abolished by King Henry VIII later that same year in 1532. Stewing in boiling liquid was a longer and arguably even more agonizing way to die than burning at the stake. The victim would linger in searing, blistering torment, skin peeling away for up to 2 hours before finally succumbing to shock or their organs fatally rupturing. The psychological dread, knowing there was nothing to do but wait in anguish for the end, must have been equally unimaginable. So ended the brief but horrific era of boiling alive in England. While only a few unfortunates met this grisly fate, their suffering was said to be among the worst of the already barbaric standards of medieval execution. The terrifying specter of the boiling cauldron joined the likes of the breaking wheel and the stake in the annals of history's most dreadful punishments, but perhaps the grimmest and most ignominious execution of all was saved for the worst crime a medieval citizen could commit: high treason against the crown. The disloyalty and betrayal of treason warranted a special kind of comeuppance, a soul-destroyingly brutal and humiliating death known as hanging, drawing, and quartering. The gory practice first arose in 13th century England as a way to literally and figuratively unmake a traitor. The public spectacle began with the accused being tied to a wooden hurdle and drawn through the streets by a horse to the place of execution, usually a central square. Jeering crowds would throw rotten vegetables and stones at the condemned, adding shame to their torment. Once at the scaffold, the prisoner would be hanged by the neck but cut down before death, merely to induce strangulation and near unconsciousness. Then the real cruelty began. Executioners would slice open the victim's abdomen and cut out his intestines and genitals, tossing them into a fire. The agony of disemboweling would shock many back to consciousness to witness their own innards burning. Finally, the head was chopped off and the body hacked into 4 pieces, dividing the traitorous person as they had sought to divide the kingdom. The severed head would be dipped in tar and displayed on London Bridge or another prominent gate, a gruesome reminder of the king's wrath, while the quartered body parts were sent to the far corners of the realm as a similar warning to others. Hundreds of victims of England's medieval political intrigue suffered hanging, drawing, and quartering, though perhaps none as famously as the Scottish knight William Wallace in 1305. Wallace was a leader of the Scottish resistance against English occupation, popularized by the film Braveheart. Captured after a fierce fight, he was condemned to a traitor's execution in London. After being dragged behind horses to the gallows, Wallace was hanged by the neck but cut down while still alive. Accounts vary on the exact order of mutilations that followed. Some say he was castrated, then disemboweled, then beheaded. Others report his stomach was sliced open first so he could watch his own entrails burn before his genitals were cut off and his heart was ripped out. Regardless, all agree it was obscenely gory and brutal, even by the cruel standards of the time. What remained of Wallace's corpse was then hacked into pieces. His tarred head was set on London Bridge, while his limbs were displayed in Newcastle Barrack, Stirling, and Perth as a warning to other Scots who would oppose English rule. The drawing and quartering of William Wallace stood as a high-profile example of the political barbarism of the medieval era, when the state sought not only to execute traitors, but to destroy them utterly through humiliation, mutilation, and dispersal. Many others met the same grisly fate over the centuries, though perhaps none as famously. While hanging, drawing, and quartering was nominally abolished in England in 1870, it had largely fallen out of practice long before then. With the last sentence being carried out in 1782, the condemned man was allowed to hang until dead before being posthumously cut down and beheaded, a small mercy by the 19th century. Such political violence came to be seen as distasteful and uncivilized, with the state apparatus of justice evolving to favor swifter, simpler, less grotesque forms of capital punishment. Thus concluded the long and grim history of England's worst execution method, hanging, drawing, and quartering. For centuries, it stood as the ultimate doom for traitors, a spectacle of suffering meant to punish not only the body but the soul, to terrify the living and desecrate the dead. Like the breaking wheel, boiling alive, and other notorious tortures of the medieval era, it has passed into the darker corners of history, an echo of a crueler time when horrific pain and humiliation were the price of betraying one's king. As we've journeyed through some of the worst tortures and punishments of the Middle Ages, a central theme emerges: the use of spectacular public violence to enforce social and political control. Brutal executions were not just about punishing the individual condemned, but about sending a message to the masses. Gruesome displays of the consequences of crime aimed to shock and scare people into obedience to the state, church, and monarch. But the extreme cruelty also reflected the precariousness of those medieval power structures. In an age of widespread poverty, inequality, and discontent, authorities lived in fear of rebellion and dissent from the populace. They knew that there were always vastly more commoners than elites, and the people could rise up if pushed too far. Grisly executions were a way to perform dominance and cow the citizenry into cow compliance. The psychology of the crowd at public executions was a strange and complex thing. Though many likely watched with genuine horror, others derived a kind of grim satisfaction or even entertainment from the proceedings. Public mutilation and killing offered a brief catharsis and spectacle in lives that were otherwise short, hard, and dreary. The community came together to collectively purge a transgressor, scapegoat, and evil, and vicariously experience some of the primal human fascinations with violence and death. Public executions also appealed to the inveterate human desire to feel morally superior. By literally placing a condemned criminal physically below them on the scaffold, the masses could reassure themselves that they were righteous and worthy in comparison, even as they took a guilty voyeuristic thrill in the gruesome show. It was a way to make sense of a harsh world and find some symbolic justice in the punishment of others. But not all executions were primarily about justice. As in the case of many accused heretics and religious minorities, the gruesome killing of Jews, Muslims, and accused witches was more about enforcing social conformity and purity than punishing any actual crime. Prejudice and paranoia fueled witch hunts and pogroms, with torture-induced confessions justifying horrific ends. The visceral suffering of burning was a physical manifestation of the eternal hellfire that supposedly awaited the souls of those who strayed from the one true faith. Yet, for all their brutality, public punishments could also elicit some sympathy for the condemned. Watching a person endure extreme agony had a way of humanizing even the lowliest criminal. Some particularly prolonged executions, like the botched burning of a penitent woman or the stoic resignation of a beloved community healer accused of witchcraft, could prompt a disturbing mix of grim satisfaction and uneasy pity in observers. It was this unsettling sense of complicity and shame that gradually eroded public appetite for the worst medieval execution methods. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about the state's right to torture and kill citizens. Reformers argued that if the people were the ultimate source of the government's authority, the justice system should reflect the people's evolving sense of decency and humanity. It came to be seen as hypocritical for the state to punish murder with even grosser premeditated murder. Ritual mutilation and execution moved behind the walls of prisons, becoming more sanitized and bureaucratized. The public spectacle shifted from the criminal's destroyed body to the solemn dignity of the legal process itself. Modern executions, like lethal injection, minimize physical suffering and disorder, hiding the messier biological realities of death. This allows the state to kill while maintaining a stance of moral rationality and decorum. There is a cold, clinical detachment to modern capital punishment that stands in contrast to the visceral gore and clamor of the medieval gallows and scaffold. We have come a long way from the days when a convict's entrails were ripped out and waved in his face before a cheering crowd. Yet we still grapple with many of the same fundamental questions about crime, punishment, and the right of the state to kill in the name of justice. Our sanitized executions behind prison walls may spare us the messy brutality of the past, but they can also allow us to avoid reckoning with the full gravity and enormity of the act. In a way, the sheer honest horror of medieval punishments forced society to confront the human cost of harsh justice in all its blood and agony. A burning or beheading was impossible to ignore, and its memory seared itself into the minds of all who witnessed it. So perhaps there is some value and necessity in revisiting these dark chapters of history, not to revel in the gore and suffering, but to remember the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance in the face of it. The tortured bodies and souls of the Middle Ages still have something to teach us about the ongoing quest to balance justice, morality, and power in our imperfect human societies. These dreadful torments may be consigned to history, but their echoes linger in our cultural consciousness and our continuing debates over crime and punishment. We are not so far removed from the medieval executioner's scaffold as we might like to believe. But in remembering the very worst of what we once inflicted on each other, we can renew our resolve to build a future of greater wisdom, mercy, and light. As we've seen, the medieval period was a time of harsh justice and brutal punishments. Even minor crimes could result in severe consequences, and those deemed the worst offenders faced unimaginably cruel fates. Public humiliation, torture, and execution were all too common in an age when life was often nasty, brutish, and short. One of the most influential figures in shaping medieval justice was King Henry II of England. Born in 1133, Henry was a powerful and ambitious monarch who sought to strengthen royal authority and establish a more centralized system of law. He introduced a number of key legal reforms, including the use of trial by jury and the appointment of professional judges to oversee cases. Henry's reforms laid the foundation for English common law, which would go on to shape legal systems around the world. However, his legacy is not without controversy. Like many medieval rulers, Henry could be ruthless in dealing with those who opposed him. In 1170, he famously clashed with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, over the rights and privileges of the church. According to contemporary accounts, an enraged Henry uttered words that were interpreted as a command to kill Becket. 4 knights, loyal to the king, rode to Canterbury Cathedral, where they brutally murdered the archbishop as he prayed at the altar. Becket's martyrdom sent shockwaves through medieval Europe and left a lasting stain on Henry's reputation. As penance for his role in Becket's death, Henry was forced to perform a public act of humiliation in 1174. He walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury while being flogged by a group of monks. This act of contrition may seem extreme by modern standards, but it reflects the pervasive religiosity of the age and the belief in the power of public penitence. Of course, not all punishments in medieval times were quite so high profile. For most ordinary people, the reality of justice was far more mundane, though no less brutal. Petty criminals and social outcasts were often subjected to a range of public humiliations designed to shame and ostracize them from the community. Imagine, if you will, a young man named Thomas, a peasant living in a small English village in the 13th century. Thomas has been caught stealing a loaf of bread from the local baker, a crime driven by hunger and desperation. As punishment, he is sentenced to a day in the stocks, a wooden device that restrains the hands and feet, leaving the offender vulnerable to public ridicule. Picture Thomas as he is led out into the village square, his head and hands locked into the heavy wooden frame. A jeering crowd gathers around him, armed with rotten fruit and vegetables, mud, and even stones. For hours, Thomas endures a barrage of filth and abuse, his face and clothes spattered with the foul-smelling detritus. As the sun begins to set, Thomas is finally released from the stocks, his limbs aching and his spirit broken. He slouches off towards home, the taunts and laughter of the crowd still ringing in his ears. For a simple act of theft, he has been subjected to a brutal and humiliating ordeal, one that will mark him as a social pariah for years to come. Thomas's story is a fictional one, but it reflects the grim realities faced by countless ordinary people in medieval times. For those on the margins of society, even a minor transgression could result in severe and lasting punishment in a world where starvation and deprivation were commonplace. The theft of a loaf of bread could be seen as a serious crime against the social order. But public humiliation was just one of many cruel punishments inflicted in the name of justice. In the shadowy corners of medieval dungeons and torture chambers, even more horrific fates awaited those accused of more serious offenses. How horrific some of those punishments must have been to endure or even to witness as a spectator in the jeering crowds. We've covered some of the most grisly and cruel fates that could befall the condemned in medieval times, from the agonizing hours of being broken on the wheel to the terrifying walk to meet the headsman's axe or burning pyre. But as brutal as these high-profile execution methods were, we shouldn't overlook the prolonged suffering inflicted by more minor punishments as well. Devices like the stocks and pillories may not have killed their occupants, but they subjected them to deep shame and disgrace. A punishment that could linger long after the rotten vegetables were washed off. Imagine for a moment the life of a petty thief in a medieval town, caught stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving family. He's dragged before the local magistrate and sentenced to a day in the stocks. As the rough wooden planks close around his wrists and ankles, he's utterly helpless, unable to hide his face or flee from the angry mob that soon surrounds him. For hours he endures a hail of insults, rotten food, and even rocks and waste hurled by the pent-up citizens, unleashing their disdain. The putrid stench of spoiled produce mingles with his own sweat, tears, and filth. Though his body may leave the stocks after a day, the shame and humiliation brand him more permanently than even the marks of a hot iron. He'll carry this disgrace like a scarlet letter. And, of course, those hot iron brands were all too real for many unfortunates. The story of Hester Prynne and her Scarlet A may be fictional, but the practice of marking adulterers, thieves, and other undesirables with searing metal was very much a fact. One can only imagine the agony as the glowing iron bit into tender flesh, sizzling and scorching the skin, the acrid scent of burning meat, the tortured screams, the struggle to hold still lest the brand blur and require a second application. And after the physical pain receded to a dull, persistent throb, the victim would still be left with an unmistakable badge of ignominy. How excruciating to go through life with your worst mistake or lowest moment literally burned into your skin for all to see and judge. In a time when one's honor and reputation meant everything, a brand was almost a fate worse than death. Speaking of fates worse than death, the mere mention of medieval torture chambers is enough to send a shiver down one's spine. The stuff of nightmares and modern horror movies, these dank, shadowy dungeons were all too real for the poor souls unfortunate enough to find themselves imprisoned there. The squalid stone walls, damp with mold and moss, would echo with the anguished cries of those suffering unimaginable agonies within. Rusting iron cages suspended from the ceiling, ominous wooden racks with leather straps to stretch out limbs, even iron maidens lined with vicious spikes, all would have been common sights in the medieval torturer's toolkit. One of the most dreaded devices was the infamous rack. Imagine being led into the clammy chamber, trembling with terror as the leather cuffs are fastened around your wrists and ankles. You stare up at the thick wooden rollers, knowing that with each turn, your limbs will be stretched farther and farther apart. Sinews strain, tendons pop, joints crackle and threaten to dislocate as the splintering pain builds. How long could you hold out against such torment? How long before you're compelled to confess to whatever accusations your tormentors level against you, true or not? The tragic case of Anne Askew comes to mind. Put on the rack for her Protestant beliefs under the reign of Henry VIII, this young woman refused to name others who shared her faith. Her limbs were stretched until her hips and knees were torn from their sockets, yet still she did not yield. Her incredible fortitude may have sealed her fate of burning at the stake as an unrepentant heretic. Sometimes, the confessions tortured out of victims on the rack or under other brutal methods led them straight to the executioner's block. In an era when justice was often harsh and evidence was flimsy, false confessions were all too common. The rack, in particular, had a notorious reputation for compelling the accused to admit to anything, simply to stop the unbearable pain. Once a confession was obtained, regardless of its veracity, the prisoner's fate was usually sealed. A public execution awaited, whether by the relatively quick and merciful method of beheading or by slower, more agonizing means meant to inflict maximum suffering and send a message to other would-be criminals. For those of noble birth or high status, the sword or axe was the usual implement of execution. In theory, decapitation was a fast death, with one swift stroke severing head from body. But the gruesome reality didn't always align with that ideal. Take the tragic case of Mary, Queen of Scots. Condemned to death for plotting against her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I Mary faced the block with renowned poise and dignity, clothed in a vibrant red gown to conceal any blood. She calmly recited prayers in Latin as she knelt and placed her head on the stump. What should have been a solemn and quick death turned into a grisly spectacle, as the executioner's first strike missed her neck and struck the back of her head. A shocked gasp rippled through the crowd. The second blow severed most of her neck, but still failed to fully decapitate. Only with a third strike could the axeman finally hack through the last sinews and gristle. As he lifted the severed head to the crowd, Mary's pained expression and lips still mouthing silent prayers bore witness to a botched and excruciating end, unfit for a queen. For commoners, hanging was a far more typical sentence, and one that usually went more according to plan, albeit no less gruesomely. The condemned would be led up to a tall wooden gallows, hands bound, a rough hempen noose draped heavily around their neck. Hooded executioner, a priest intoning last rites, and a gathered crowd of stern-faced witnesses set a somber scene. The trapdoor would drop open with a rattle of hinges, plunging the condemned through the dangle at the end of the rope. If the fall was long enough and the noose positioned just right, death would come quickly as the neck snapped. More often, though, the victim would kick and struggle in a macabre dance, slowly strangling to death with bulging eyes and a protruding tongue. As the minutes dragged by, the crowd watched solemnly until the twitching stilled, and it was clear the deed was done. Death by hanging, the ignoble end of thieves, brigands, and peasant rabble. Pressing, or crushing, was another grim way to go, and one reserved for some very specific offenses. Those who refused to enter a plea at their trial could be subjected to pain, hard, and forceful punishment to compel them to speak. The accused would be laid on their back, naked, with a heavy board placed across their chest. Then weights or stones would be piled on, one by one, slowly constricting their breathing as the tremendous pressure mounted. The ordeal could last for hours or even days as more and more weight compressed the chest and vital organs. Shallow. Labor breaths would grow further and further apart. Ribs would splinter and crack. Lungs collapse, and the heart strain to beat under the crushing load. Eventually, the poor soul would either gasp out a plea or expire from the slow agony of suffocation. One of the most famous cases of pressing was that of Margaret Clitheroe, put to death in this excruciating manner in 1586. Her crime, harboring Catholic priests at a time when Catholicism was outlawed in England. Stripped and laid between two doors, she was crushed under 800 pounds of rocks over the course of 15 minutes before she succumbed. Her last words were to pray for the Queen's salvation. Her steadfast faith in the face of such brutality led to her eventual beatification as a martyr. Burning at the stake was another particularly dreadful way to die, the visceral opposite of the holy cremation that marked an exalted end in some cultures. In medieval Europe, death by burning was reserved for sins of the soul and crimes against the church, punishments for heretics, blasphemers, and unrepentant witches. The condemned will be led to a towering pyre stacked high with bundles of dry kindling and tar-soaked logs. A stout wooden post rose from the center, adorned with iron shackles or chains. As the prisoner was bound tightly to the stake, priests would make one final attempt to extract a confession and reconciliation with the church, the only path to salvation for their mortal soul. Whether they recanted or stood firm, the results were the same. Unforgiving flames would soon envelop them. Imagine the tremendous heat from the roaring blaze lapping at your skin, scorching your feet, making each breath sear your lungs. Cinders and sparks sting your eyes as stinging, acrid smoke clogs your nostrils. As tongues of fire lick higher, they blister and blacken the skin, rupturing and peeling it away in gory flaps and strips. One can only pray that the caustic smoke suffocates and kills before the flames fully engulf the body. Such was the torturous fate of the famous Joan of Arc, the defiant young maiden who led the French army against the English. Condemned as a heretic for her brazen rebellion and insistence on male dress, she was burned at the stake in 1431 at the tender age of 19. In a final act of cruelty, her executioners raked back the flames when she was on the brink of death, so the gathered crowd could watch her expire. Her anguished cries of Jesus echoed in the square long after the pyre collapsed to ash and embers. The rare punishment of boiling alive was every bit as shuddersome as burning, and then some. In a few gruesome cases in England, prisoners who committed acts of treason, murder, or even coin counterfeiting could be condemned to death by boiling in water or oil. One of the most notorious instances was that of Richard Roos, the cook of an English bishop, convicted of poisoning his master and several other unfortunate diners. His sentence was to be boiled to death at London's notorious execution spot of Smithfield in 1532. A great cauldron was erected and filled with water. Roos was strung up by his torso and repeatedly dunked in the scalding water. The flesh was literally boiled from his bones over the course of an agonizing hour until he finally succumbed. It's impossible to imagine the excruciating pain of being immersed in blistering hot liquid, skin peeling away, eyes and mouth searing. Each desperate gasp for air would only scald the throat and fill the lungs. Any witnesses surely recoiled from the hideous shrieks and grim stench of cooking flesh. But not before the ghastly sight was seared forever in their memories as a warning against the unimaginable suffering awaiting traitors. Perhaps the most elaborate and grisly form of execution was the notorious practice of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Mercifully rare, this was the ultimate punishment for crimes of high treason against the crown. The condemned man, usually a rebel or conspirator against the king, would first be dragged to the gallows on a slatted wooden hurdle pulled by a horse. Already brutalized and bloodied by the rough journey, he would then be hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive. What followed next was a gruesome butchering and dismemberment that shocked even the most hardened executioners and onlookers. As the prisoner lay dazed and struggling on the blood-slicked platform, the executioner would take his knife and slice open his abdomen with practiced cuts. Reaching inside the gaping cavity, he would pull out fistfuls of slippery, steaming entrails and toss them into a waiting cauldron. The man's screams of agony rent the air, soon turning to guttural gurgles as he choked on his own blood. But the ordeal was far from over. With the victim in shock and mercifully unconscious, the executioner would hack off his head with an axe and hold it aloft for the cheering crowd. Then the arms and legs were severed as well, leaving a mutilated and unrecognizable torso behind. In a final desecration, the head and limbs would often be dipped in tar and displayed at the city gates or other public spots as a grim warning to others. The famous Scottish freedom fighter William Wallace allegedly suffered this grisly fate after leading a rebellion against English rule in the 13th century. After being captured and tried in London for high treason, Wallace was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still conscious. His organs burned before his eyes. Finally, he was beheaded and quartered, his severed head dipped in tar and mounted on a spike atop London Bridge. His 4 limbs were sent to the far corners of Britain as a stark warning against treason and defiance of the English crown. As we reflect back on these brutal scenes and shudder-inducing ordeals, it's natural to feel a mix of horror, revulsion, and perhaps even morbid curiosity. The dark chapters of history hold a grim fascination, even as they repel us with their cruelty. It's hard to fathom the depths of suffering that our fellow humans have inflicted on one another in the name of justice, religion, or social order. But we must remember that these stomach-churning punishments, as horrific as they seem to our modern sensibilities, were very much a product of their time. In an era when life was often nasty, brutish, and short, when superstition held sway, and the average person lived in grinding poverty and backbreaking labor, justice was equally harsh and unforgiving. The methods of torture and execution we described were seen as a necessary means of maintaining law and order, of deterring crime and punishing those who dared to transgress against God or king. They were a visceral reminder of the immense power wielded by the state and the church, and the terrible consequences of defying that power. It's also worth noting that many of these gruesome practices persisted well beyond the medieval era. While the Middle Ages are often portrayed as a particularly barbaric and backwards time, the truth is that torture, mutilation, and grisly executions continued into the early modern period of the 1500s to 1800s. The rack, for instance, was still in use during the Tudor era in England, employed to extract confessions from religious and political prisoners. Burning at the stake reached a peak during the Protestant Reformation, when both Catholic and Protestant authorities used it to punish heretics on both sides. And hanging, drawing, and quartering remained on the books as a punishment for treason in England until the early 1800s, although it was used more sparingly by then. So as much as we might like to relegate these horrors to a distant, unenlightened past, the fact is that they were very much a part of the fabric of European society for centuries. Only gradually, with the spread of Enlightenment ideals of reason, justice, and human rights in the 1700s and 1800s, did these grim rituals of death and suffering begin to fade into history. Today, we look back on the savageries of the past with a mix of fascinated horror and solemn reverence for those who suffered unimaginable agonies. We give thanks for the relative peace, prosperity, and rule of law that prevails in much of the modern world, while acknowledging that cruelty and injustice still persist in too many places. But perhaps, by confronting and remembering the darkest deeds of history, we can renew our commitment to building a world of greater compassion, dignity, and mercy for all. A world where no one need fear the rack, the stake, or the hangman's noose. A world where justice is tempered with wisdom, and where even the lowest among us is treated with respect. As you drift off to sleep, pondering these heavy themes, take comfort in the progress we've made and the countless souls who work to bend the arc of history towards justice. While the past may be stained with blood and tears, the future is ours to shape into something brighter. Sweet dreams of a better world to come, however slow and halting the journey there may be. As night falls over a medieval village, the only light comes from flickering torches illuminating the grim stone walls of the local lord's castle. For the unfortunate souls imprisoned within those walls, the darkness brings no respite, only the dread of what new torments the morning may bring. Because in these brutal times, the penalties for crimes, both great and small, are often horrific beyond imagination. One of the most common punishments, reserved for thieves, adulterers, and other petty criminals, is a stint in the stocks or pillory. Picture, if you will, a hapless peasant, perhaps a young man who stole a loaf of bread to feed his starving family. He is dragged into the village square and locked into a wooden frame, his head and hands protruding through holes, unable to move or hide his face. For hours or even days, he is subjected to the jeers and taunts of the locals, who pelt him with rotten fruit and vegetables until he is covered in putrid filth. The stench attracts flies, which buzz around his head incessantly. His muscles cramp agonizingly, but he cannot shift position. It is a slow, humiliating torture. For more serious offenses, the punishments grow harsher still. These may be subjected to branding, their flesh seared with a red-hot iron bearing the letter T as a permanent mark of their crimes. Imagine the acrid scent of burning skin, the screams of agony as the iron is pressed into the cheek or forehead, leaving a ravaged, blistered welt. The pain is excruciating, but the shame is, in some ways, worse. From that day forward, the marked criminal is shunned by all, unable to find work or lodging, forever an outcast. One such branded thief was a woman named Alice Reeves in 14th century London. Desperate to provide for her 3 young children after her husband died, Alice pilfered a silver candlestick from a merchant's home where she worked as a maid. She was caught trying to pawn the item. At her trial, the court decreed that as this was her first offense, she would be spared execution. Instead, she would be branded on the cheek and released. As the iron was heated in the courtroom fireplace, Alice trembled and wept, begging for mercy. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. The bailiff seized her head and pressed the searing metal against her face as she screamed. The stench of burnt flesh filled the chamber. When the iron was removed, it took some of her skin with it, leaving the T burned into her cheekbone. Alice was cast out onto the street, crying in pain and despair, her life forever ruined by one desperate mistake. But even branding pales in comparison to the ordeals inflicted on prisoners in torture chambers. Many medieval castles had these dank windowless cells where the work of extracting confessions took place away from prying eyes. The dungeons reek of mold, human waste, and fear. In the flickering torchlight, an array of gruesome devices hung on the walls: tongs, pincers, irons. When the castle's lord or inquisitor wished to interrogate a prisoner, they would have the accused brought to the chamber in shackles. A common torture was the rack, a wooden frame fitted with ropes and cranks. The prisoner would be tied down, arms and legs outstretched, then the torturer would turn the cranks, tightening the ropes, slowly stretching the limbs. Joints would strain against their sockets, ligaments would start to tear, bones would crack. The agony was unbearable. Many prisoners would confess to anything, true or not, just to make the pain stop. Imagine a man accused of plotting against his king, dragged screaming to the rack in the middle of the night. He proclaims his innocence even as his arms are wrenched up above his head and his ankles bound. The splintery wood digs into his back as the ropes pull tighter and tighter. He prays aloud, promising God that he will be good, that he will never sin again if only the torment will end. The crank turns, his shoulders start to pop from their sockets, and his prayers dissolve into agonized wailing. The torturer asks again for a confession. At first the prisoner refuses, but as the pressure builds and his muscles begin to tear, he breaks in a hoarse, ragged scream. He admits to treason, black magic, devil worship, anything his accuser suggests, all lies, but the lies will buy him a quicker death than the slow ruin of the rack. Torture was not limited to stretching. Thumb screws were a common and excruciating method of extracting information. These crude metal vices were tightened around the fingers or toes, slowly crushing them to pulp as the prisoner shrieked in agony. The pain was so intense that many victims would pass out. They would be revived with buckets of freezing water, only to have the screws tightened further until the bone splintered. The ruined digits would often have to be amputated later, leaving the survivor maimed. Another brutal technique was the strappado, a kind of reverse hanging. The accused would have their hands bound behind their back and then be hoisted into the air by a rope tied to their wrists. The weight of their body would wrench their arms backward and upward, dislocating the shoulders with a sickening pop. Prisoners would be dropped and raised repeatedly, each time tearing the joints further out of their sockets until they confessed or lost consciousness the arms. It was an absolutely excruciating ordeal. One of the best documented cases of strappado torture was that of the Templar Knights in the early 1300s. This powerful Catholic military order was accused of heresy and witchcraft by King Philip IV of France, who coveted their wealth. Dozens of Templars, including the elderly Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were arrested and brutally tortured by royal inquisitors. Many of the knights were subjected to the strappado over and over, their shoulders wrenched out of place until they signed false confessions. Some had their feet held over flames to increase their agony. Under such duress, It's no wonder these battle-hardened warriors broke and admitted to all manner of blasphemy and depravity. In the end, the Male and many of his men were burned at the stake based on confessions extracted through torture. It was a grim end to a once noble order. As horrific as torture was, at least its victims usually survived if maimed and traumatized. Those condemned to execution faced an even more nightmarish fate. One of the milder execution methods was beheading. It was considered a quick, merciful death and was thus often reserved for nobles and royalty. In reality, beheading was still a gory, agonizing ordeal. Contrary to popular belief, the severed head does not die instantly. Experts believe it may retain consciousness for up to 10 seconds, based on studies of other guillotined animals. Most medieval beheadings were performed with an axe or sword, not a single-stroke guillotine. This made the process even more prolonged and painful. It could take multiple blows to fully decapitate the condemned, especially if the executioner was inexperienced, hesitant, or simply inept. One of the most famously botched beheadings was that of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587. After a lifetime of controversy, conspiracy, and imprisonment, Mary was condemned to death for plotting to assassinate her cousin, Queen Elizabeth of England. On the fateful morning, Mary mounted the scaffold draped in black, clutching a prayer book. After a final prayer, she gracefully knelt and placed her head on the block, her gray hair tucked into a coif. The axeman took his position and raised his blade, but his first blow missed Mary's slender neck and struck the back of her head, shattering her skull. She let out a groan, her body twitching. It took 2 more hacking blows to finally sever her head, the blood spurting in vivid crimson jets over the wooden platform. As the executioner lifted the detached head by the hair to show the crowd, he famously proclaimed, "God save the Queen," in reference to Elizabeth. But to his horror, he was left grasping only Mary's wig. Her head tumbled to the ground and rolled, coming to rest face up, the lips still moving in silent prayer. It was a gruesome end for the once lovely Scottish queen. Hanging was an even more common form of capital punishment, especially for commoners. The traditional short drop method did not break the neck. Rather, it strangled the condemned to death slowly, often taking many agonizing minutes of kicking and writhing at rope's end. Witnesses described the faces of the hanged, turning mottled shades of purple and black, their eyes bulging hideously, their tongues protruding. Some would foam at the mouth, their bowels and bladders loosening to soil their clothes. It was a horrible, ignominious way to die. Public hangings were a popular spectacle, drawing huge crowds. Imagine the scene: a warm summer morning, the sun glinting off the dew-dampened grass. The gallows stands stark against a clear blue sky. The ever-present raven squawking and circling, a hush falls over the gathered throng as the condemned is led out, hands bound, a rough hemp noose draped around their neck. A local official drones out the charges: murder, rape, treason. The hangman pulls a rough claw hood over the accused's face. There's a tense pause, then with a snap of the lever, the trap door opens. The hooded figure plummets, pulled up short with a sickening crack as the rope goes taut. Slowly, the kicking weakens, then stops. The body hangs limp, swaying gently in the morning breeze, a gruesome warning to all who would transgress the law. While beheading and hanging were relatively quick, some capital punishments were specifically designed to prolong the agony. Pressing, for instance, involved placing increasingly heavy stones on the chest of the condemned until they either confessed or were crushed to death. The stones would be added gradually, the weight growing from uncomfortable to painful to unbearable. It could take hours or even days for the accused to succumb, their ribs slowly cracking, the breath squeezed from their body ounce by torturous ounce. It was a truly hellish way to die. One of the most famous victims of pressing was a woman named Margaret Clitheroe in 1586. Margaret was a devout Catholic convert at a time when Catholicism was outlawed in England. She harbored fugitive priests in her home and held secret masses. Eventually, she was arrested and sentenced to pressing for refusing to enter a plea to the charges, believing the government had no right to try her for her faith. On the day of her execution, Margaret was stripped naked and spread-eagled on the ground, with a sharp rock beneath her spine, her wrists and ankles bound to stakes. A rough wooden door was placed on her chest and piled with stones. As the weight increased, she gasped out prayers, her ribs cracking audibly. For 15 agonizing minutes, more and more rocks were heaped on, witnesses marveling at her stoic endurance. With a final torture gasp, Margaret's sternum shattered and her heart was crushed. In later years, she would be celebrated as a Catholic martyr who died for her belief. But in the moment, she was just another broken body sacrificed to the brutality of the age. Even more horrendous punishments awaited those convicted of heresy, witchcraft, or treason. Burning at the stake was a common sentence for these crimes against God. The condemned would be tied to a tall wooden post in the town square, bundles of firewood stacked around their feet as crowds watched in eager anticipation. The kindling would be set alight, the flames licking hungrily upwards. The fire would build slowly, the heat growing more intense second by second. Smoke would sting the eyes and choke the breath of the accused. Their clothes would catch, the fabric shriveling away to leave blistering, blackening skin. Fat would start to melt and sizzle sickeningly. Eventually, the flames would reach the face, the hair igniting in a brief corona before the flesh began to char and peel away. The screaming was said to be unimaginable, high, shrill, almost inhuman. It would gradually weaken to feeble moans. Then silence as the vocal cords were seared away and the lungs succumbed to the searing heat. In the end, there would be nothing left but a twisted, smoldering corpse slumped against the stake, wreathed in greasy smoke. Perhaps the most famous victim of burning was Joan of Arc, the teenage French peasant girl turned visionary military leader. Guided by the voices of saints, Joan led the French army to improbable victories against the English. But her success earned her powerful enemies. Captured and tried for heresy and witchcraft, the 19-year-old was condemned to the flames. On the morning of her execution, Joan was dressed in a long white robe, her head shaved. She wept as she was tied to the towering stake, pleading for a cross to gaze upon in her final moments. One of the sympathetic priests fashioned a small crucifix from 2 twigs and held it up to her as the pyre was lit. Joan fixed her eyes upon it as the flames rose around her, calling out, "Jesus, Jesus!" Her cries turned to agonized shrieks as the fire engulfed her slender body. Within minutes, she fell silent, succumbing to the smoke and the searing heat. As the flames died away, the charred corpse crumbled to ash in a cruel twist. Joan's remains were cast into the river to prevent them being collected as holy relics. It was a tragic end for a young woman who had accomplished so much. Perhaps even more ghastly than burning was the punishment of the breaking wheel. This grisly sentence was reserved for only the most heinous crimes, such as banditry, murder, and treason. The condemned would be lashed spread-eagled to a large wooden wagon wheel, their limbs stretched out along the spokes. The executioner would then use an iron bar to methodically shatter the bones in each arm and leg with heavy, hammer-like blows. The dull, splintering cracks of breaking bone would mingle with the victim's agonized screams and the jeers of the crowd. Once each limb had been crushed to a pulpy mess, the executioner would thread the mangled arms and legs through the spokes of the wheel. The wheel would then be hoisted up on a tall pole and left to spin slowly in the wind. The broken, bleeding body splayed across it was left as a grim warning. Death on the wheel was slow and excruciating, the victim lingering for hours or even days before finally succumbing to blood loss or shock. Sometimes crows or other scavengers would arrive to peck at the helpless condemned as they groaned and writhed weakly. It was a spectacle as brutal as it was effective at deterring crime. One of the most infamous breakings happened in 1757 to Robert Francois Damiens, who attempted to assassinate King Louis, the 15th of France. Damiens stabbed the king with a penknife, causing a minor wound. It was a crime of staggering audacity, and one that demanded a horrific retribution. Damiens was condemned to be broken alive, then dismembered by horses, his body burned, and the ashes scattered to the wind. The execution was a public spectacle attended by thousands. Damiens was fastened to a scaffold with iron shackles as the executioner heated pincers in a brazier. These red-hot tongs were used to methodically tear the skin and flesh from his arms, legs, and chest. The wounds quickly cauterized by the searing metal to prolong his suffering. Molten lead and boiling oil were poured into the gaping holes as Damien screamed in unfathomable agony. Next came the breaking. Each limb was inflexibly bound to a stout wooden plank. And with meticulous care, the executioner shattered the bones with an iron bar, turning the limbs to jelly with precise, pulverizing blows. The broken, twisted arms and legs were then threaded through a wheel and hoisted up for all to see, a red ruin of flesh, sinew, and splintered bone. Incredibly, Damiens remained conscious and lucid, crying to God for mercy. Finally, in an attempted coup de grace, 4 horses were harnessed to each mutilated limb, whipped to pull in opposite directions to tear Damiens asunder in one swift, brutal motion. But his tendons had been so destroyed by the tongs and the wheel that his limbs would not separate. The horses strained repeatedly against his dead weight as he wailed in boundless torment. It took many attempts and multiple axe blows to finally sever each arm and leg. The detached, shredded stumps were tossed into a fire along with Damien's blood-drained torso. The stench of burning meat filled the Parisian square as the assassin's remains were reduced to oily black ash. The execution had lasted an unimaginable 3 hours. It was a slow death of unthinkable sadism, a level of cruelty difficult for the modern mind to fathom, but to the frenzied crowd, it was a just retribution against the branding wasn't only used to mark thieves and adulterers. It was also a punishment inflicted on other offenders like runaway slaves, deserting soldiers, religious dissenters, and seditious rebels challenging the crown. The mark was meant not just as a penalty, but as a visible permanent warning to all of society about the consequences of transgression. Imagine a young woman named Alice, a peasant from a small English village in the year 1405. She had the misfortune of getting pregnant out of wedlock, a moral crime in the eyes of the church. As penance for her sin, the local authorities sentenced her to be branded on the face with the letter S for her unchaste sex. Picture Alice being dragged to the center of town, her arms bound tightly behind her back. The villagers gather around to witness her disgrace, their faces a mix of pity, disgust, and morbid fascination. A grim-faced clergyman reads out her crime and sentence, his voice dripping with condemnation. Alice sobs and begs for mercy, but her pleas fall on deaf ears. The blacksmith approaches, clutching a glowing hot iron poker from his forge. The metal tip is shaped into a menacing letter S. He positions it just inches from Alice's tear-stained cheek as she writhes against the rough hands restraining her. With a swift, forceful motion, the blacksmith presses the searing brand into her delicate skin. Alice lets out an ungodly shriek of agony as smoke rises from her branded flesh. The stench of burning skin mingles with the palpable terror and revulsion of the crowd. After several excruciating seconds, the poker is removed, leaving behind a raw, blistered S. It's a mark of damnation that will forever mar not only Alice's face, but her whole existence in this judgmental world. As the years go by, Alice's brand heals into a raised, discolored scar. It's an inescapable reminder of her youthful indiscretion, one that affects every aspect of her hard-scrabble life. Mothers pull their children closer as she passes in the street, warning them not to end up like Scarlet Alice. She is shunned by most everyone in the village. No respectable man will marry her, and even employers hesitate to hire her. Alice covers the shameful mark with her hair and tries to hold her head high. But always, whether alone or in a crowd, she feels the brand searing into her very soul. In a society obsessed with sin and moral purity, a branded woman like Alice was as good as dead to love, dead to hope, dead to any semblance of a normal life. Such was the power of the brand to punish and ostracize, to condemn a transgressor to a lifetime on the margins. Of course, people of higher rank had ways to escape the brand's stigma. A noble woman who fornicated might be sent to a convent rather than face public branding. A wealthy merchant could potentially bribe his way out of the sentence or have it commuted to a fine. But for commoners like Alice, the brand was a lifelong cross to bear, a torturous reminder that she failed to meet society's harsh demands. Branding as a punishment dates back to ancient times, but it reached its cruel zenith in medieval Europe. Millions of people over the centuries were disfigured and socially exiled by this brutal practice. Some may view Alice as an immoral woman who got her just desserts. But her tragic tale reveals the incredible cruelty of a world, where one mistake could forever condemn even the humblest citizen to the pitiless wrath of church and state. With that sobering thought, let us leave poor Alice to her never-ending torment and continue our journey into the darker recesses of medieval justice. We descend now into the dank bowels of the torture chamber, a hell of human creation where the cries of the damned echo ceaselessly. Steel your nerves and gird your stomach, dear listener, for the worst is yet to come. The medieval dungeon was a shadowy labyrinth of suffering, a stone-clad womb of misery where the forsaken were swallowed up to face their nightmares made real. These subterranean chambers were often carved directly into the bedrock beneath a castle's keep, as cold and unyielding as the hearts of the monsters who constructed them. Imagine a damp, frigid cell hewn from coarse limestone. The only light filters in through a small, barred window high up the wall. A weak and sickly illumination that does little to dispel the oppressive gloom. The air is thick with the stench of decay, despair, and human suffering. Chains and manacles hang from the walls, still greasy from the flesh and fluids of previous occupants. Dry blood speckles the floor along with itinerant rat droppings and motoring straw. Into this foul oubliette, the accused were thrown to await their interrogation and torment at the hands of professional torturers. These grotesque men were artists of agony, masters of extracting confessions through the infliction of hideous bodily anguish. Their grim arsenal consisted of diabolical devices like the rack, the strappado, and the iron maiden, infernal machines designed for one sinister purpose: to break the body and shatter the spirit. The rack was one of the most widely used of these instruments. It consisted of a large rectangular wooden frame with rollers at both ends. The victim was spread-eagled naked upon the cordage and bound by the wrists and ankles. As the interrogator posed his questions, the rollers were turned by handles, steadily increasing the tension on the ropes. Envision a burly jailer cranking the creaking wooden cogs, tightening the ropes, and stretching the helpless prisoner's body to its utmost limits. Limbs elongate agonizingly, muscles and sinews scream in protest, joints crack and strain against their sockets. The hapless captive howls in pain, feeling his very bones slowly separating. Yet still the implacable inquisitor continues, determined to wring out a confession, true or false, via this excruciating method. There are many documented cases of people being literally torn asunder on the rack, rent limb from limb until their taut and tortured sinews could take no more and gave way with a sickening wet snap. One can only imagine the ungodly shrieks and groans, the percussive pops of dislocation, the warm blood spattering as skin and muscle distend beyond their capacities and rip like overwrought linen. Of course, the skilled torturer aimed to draw out the torment for as long as possible, bringing his subject to the very edge of annihilation before backing off, allowing the extorted admission or accusation to spill forth from cracked, parched lips. The power of the rack to elicit a desired confession was undeniable, and that was the true evil of the device, more than even the grievous physical wounds it inflicted. A person would say anything, invent any fiction, condemn any innocent to halt the hell of the rack. Consider the case of Nicholas Brown, an English papist implicated in a plot against King James I in 1604. Agents of the crown arrested Brown and put him to the rack, stretching him mercilessly for hours on end. Delirious with pain, the young priest invented wild stories about a conspiracy between the Pope and the Spanish to invade England and assassinate the monarch. None of it was true, but the tormented Brown would have gladly denounced his own mother if it would relieve his suffering on the rack. Such was the insanity-inducing power of this vile apparatus. The rack left its mangled victims permanently scarred, both in body and in mind, assuming they even survived the ordeal. They often lost the use of tortured limbs, developed chronic pain and overextended joints, and were haunted by searing dread and the nightmare sounds of their own anguished screams. And always, in the lurid theater of their memories, there would remain the leering faces of their tormentors, their hands on the rollers, asking, always asking, as they strained and contorted on the very precipice of human endurance. So vivid was this torture, so indelible its cruel brand on the psyche, that some prisoners continued to have startling confessions spill unbidden from their lips long after their stint on the rack was over. A few were so shattered that they went to the gallows reciting the fictitious crimes squeezed out of them, the false witness beaten out of their broken flesh by the pitiless machinery of the medieval Inquisition. With a rueful sigh, we turn now from the rack and its wretched recipients, but do not unclench yet, gentle listener, for our macabre tour of dungeon depravities has only begun. More monstrous devices await in the gloom, each more fiendishly conceived than the last. So down, down we go, spiraling into a Stygian pit of institutionalized torment, where no glimmer of benevolence or mercy can penetrate. After the Catholic woman Margaret Clitheroe was slowly pressed to death over 15 agonizing minutes for the crime of harboring priests, her broken body was put on grotesque public display. Her fate served as a chilling warning to others who might defy the laws against Catholicism. Yet many continued to risk the same terrible punishment to secretly practice their forbidden faith. Such religious persecution was all too common in medieval Europe. Charges of heresy could result in the most dreadful deaths, often by burning at the stake. One of history's most famous victims of this cruel sentence was the French peasant girl turned military leader Joan of Arc. Joan's early life gave little indication of her extraordinary destiny. Born to humble farmers around the year 1412, she had a fairly typical peasant childhood, but as a deeply pious young girl, Joan began experiencing vivid religious visions that she believed were messages from God. Divine voices guided her to take up arms and help crown a French king to drive out the occupying English forces. Displaying remarkable charisma and conviction, the teenage Joan gained an audience with the French royal court. She won the tentative support of Crown Prince Charles, who desperately needed a morale boost for his beleaguered troops. Outfitted in men's armor and wielding a white banner, Joan led the French to several improbable victories against the English, bringing hope to her war-weary people. But Joan's brilliant military career proved short-lived. In 1430, she was captured by enemy soldiers loyal to England and put on trial for heresy and witchcraft in a sham inquisition. Hostile clerics tried to trap the illiterate farm girl with theological wordplay. Joan's claims of divine guidance were used to condemn her as a blasphemous heretic. Found guilty, the 19-year-old was sentenced to burn at the stake. On the morning of her execution, Joan was tied to a tall pillar in the town square of Rouen, with bundles of wood stacked beneath her feet. As crowds looked on, the pyre was set alight. Witnesses recalled the thick smoke and fierce heat of the rising flames, engulfing the slight figure in white. Joan's anguished cries carried over the crackle of the blaze, until finally her once lively voice fell silent. The English executioners raked back the coals to reveal the blackened, smoking corpse. But Joan's heart, it was said, remained untouched by the flames. Her ashes were callously scattered in the River Seine. In a cruel twist of fate, Joan was later cleared of all charges and declared a martyr by the Pope. Today, the illiterate peasant girl is venerated as a saint, while her English persecutors are remembered as the true villains. For the crime of unwavering faith, Joan of Arc suffered an excruciating death, her short life extinguished in one of the most terrible execution methods ever conceived. Burning was considered a particularly fitting punishment for heretics, as the purifying power of flames was thought to destroy evil and cleanse the soul. But other horrific forms of execution were also used to make a lasting example out of the condemned. The gruesome spectacle of the breaking wheel was almost unrivaled in its slow cruelty. Typically reserved for the most loathed criminals, breaking on the wheel began with the victim firmly tied to a large cartwheel, limbs splayed between the spokes. With a heavy iron cudgel or the blunt edge of an axe, the executioner would methodically smash the knees, elbows, shoulders, and hips, shattering each joint with hammer-like blows. Some variations started with the legs and worked up, prolonging the agony. Shattered bones ripped through flesh as the wheel slowly revolved, turning the criminal into a mangled wreck. The grisly remains would then be woven through the wheel spokes and hoisted on a tall pole, left to die of shock and exposure over hours or days, crows pecking at their flesh. The broken bodies served as a grim reminder of the price of crossing the law. One of the most infamous victims of the breaking wheel was the highwayman Peter Stump, better known as the werewolf of Bedburg in 16th century Germany. Stump spread terror across the countryside, accused not only of murder and robbery, but of black magic, rape, cannibalism, and shape-shifting into a ravenous, wolf-like beast. While the more fantastical charges against Stump seemed like fearful peasant superstition, his reputation as a violent bandit was well established. After his capture in 1589, Stump confessed under torture to killing 13 children and 2 pregnant women, ripping the fetuses from their wombs to devour. He expressed no remorse for his depraved crimes. Condemned as an incorrigible menace to society, Stump was sentenced to a singularly brutal combination of punishments. On the day of his public execution, the werewolf of Bedburg was first lashed to a wooden wheel. The executioner took his time, pulverizing each of Stump's limbs, drawing out his blood-curdling howls with the wheel slowly rotating. The bandit's shattered arms and legs flopped about obscenely, to the horror and fascination of the crowd. But Stump's ordeal was far from over. Next, his mangled body was unbound and fastened to a sturdy table in full view of the enthralled mob. Stump had his flesh ripped from his broken bones with sharp pincers in 10 agonizing places. The mutilated highwayman was then finally put out of his misery by beheading. As a final insult, Stump's corpse was burned to ashes, denying him a Christian burial. His torture and execution was remembered for generations as a reminder of the savagery of the law and the even greater savagery of the criminals who lived outside it. Such extreme public punishments were considered a necessary deterrent to maintain order in a harsh, lawless time. Another exceptionally cruel method of execution with an audience in mind was boiling alive. The terrible spectacle of a human being slowly cooked to death was sure to leave an impression on even the most jaded medieval minds. The practice of boiling criminals alive dates back to ancient Babylonia and was used throughout the medieval period for crimes like coin counterfeiting, poisoning, and murder. A large kettle or cauldron was filled with water, oil, tar, or even molten lid and placed over a roaring fire. The cauldron was often put on public display in the hours beforehand, the rising steam and bubbling surface hinting at unimaginable agonies to come. When the liquid reached a torturous temperature, the condemned would be lowered in with ropes or chains, thrashing and shrieking as their skin reddened and blistered on contact. More often, the victim was suspended above the seething vat and slowly immersed over time, intensifying the pain as the minutes ticked by. Flesh sloughed from bones in gruesome strips, eyeballs burst, and internal organs cooked inside the body. No matter how much they begged for mercy or struggled to escape, the outcome was always the same: an ugly, agonizing demise. After a seeming eternity, the criminal's lifeless stewed corpse would be fished out with hooks and unceremoniously dumped for disposal. One of England's most high-profile murders by boiling occurred in 1531. Richard Roos, a cook in the household of the powerful Bishop of Rochester, was arrested for attempting to poison the clergyman and his guests. Roos had allegedly stirred a lethal toxin into a pot of porridge, killing 2 people and sickening many others. While Roos claimed it was an accident, he was convicted of treason for his suspected assassination attempt and sentenced to be boiled alive. To make an example of Roos, King Henry VIII ordered a special act of Parliament just for the occasion, declaring that all prisoners condemned for poison would henceforth share the cook's horrific fate. On the day of the execution, Roos was paraded through the streets of London to the cheers and jeers of the crowd. At the gruesome scene, he was bound and suspended with ropes over a bubbling cauldron. As he was slowly lowered in, inch by torturous inch, Roos's agonized wails filled the air. Londoners looked on in morbid glee as the poisoner was boiled to death before their eyes. In a show of royal authority, Rules's ghastly execution stood for centuries as a warning against crossing the crown and the reviled crime of poisoning. Perhaps the only medieval punishment even more notorious than boiling alive was the dreadful practice of hanging, drawing, and quartering, reserved for the most hated enemies of the state. This grisly combination of execution methods was designed to inflict the maximum possible suffering and indignity. The ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering usually began with the condemned being tied to a wooden hurdle or fence panel and dragged through the streets by a horse. The jostling, scraping journey to the scaffold was both degrading and agonizing, leaving the prisoner bruised and bloody before the execution even began. Upon reaching the public square, a jeering crowd gathered to witness the spectacle. The first step was hanging, but only partially. The condemned would be dropped from a platform with a rope around their neck, but cut down and revived before they could choke to death. Then came the drawing, a euphemism for disemboweling. The executioner would take a sharp knife and slice open the prisoner's abdomen, pulling out yards of slippery intestines and organs and tossing them into a waiting bucket or fire. Mercifully, this was often fatal, but not always. If the condemned was still alive, they faced the final horror of quartering. Their body would be hacked into 4 pieces with an axe. The severed head was often put on a spike, and the quarter sent to the far corners of the kingdom as a terrifying display of the king's wrath. Sometimes the head was even dipped in tar to preserve it as a long-lasting warning. The quarter pieces might be left with the crows, tossed into a fire, or buried in unconsecrated ground, denying the eternal rest of a proper Christian burial. The grim litany of criminals subjected to hanging, drawing, and quartering reads like a who's who of medieval English villains. In 1305, Scottish rebel leader William Wallace was given a traitor's execution for rising up against King Edward I. The fierce warrior suffered the full punishment, hanged by the neck, cut down while still alive, disemboweled, beheaded, and cruelly quartered. In 1606, Guy Fawkes met the same terrible fate for his role in the failed gunpowder plot to assassinate King James, and restore a Catholic monarch. Fawkes was sentenced to the usual traitor's death, but he cheated the executioner by jumping from the scaffold and breaking his own neck. His co-conspirators weren't so lucky, enduring the grisly full quartering as crowds roared in bloodthirsty approval. The last victim to be hanged, drawn, and quartered in England was the French spy Francois-Henri de la Motte, executed in 1781 for treason. His screams haunted witnesses for years after. While the punishment was later officially abolished as a relic of a more brutal age, its gory legacy remains seared into history and popular imagination, a reminder of the cruel extremes of the medieval justice system. Why were the punishments of the Middle Ages so brutal and barbaric by today's standards? In part, it's because people led short, harsh, dangerous lives, intimately acquainted with death and suffering. Executions were public entertainment, a salutary spectacle. There was little sympathy for the cruel fates of criminals and outcasts. But ironically, over-the-top punishments may have encouraged worse behavior in the long run. If all crimes were punished severely, there was little incentive for restraint. It was a vicious cycle of cruelty, begetting more cruelty. Gratefully, our modern justice systems have come a long way from the torture chambers and gallows of old. The medieval thirst for vengeance and retribution has largely given way to principles of fairness, rehabilitation, and humane treatment of prisoners. Most countries have abolished the death penalty entirely. We can look back on the monstrous punishments of the Middle Ages as a grim but fascinating relic of our distant past, a part of our history that we are grateful to leave behind. As the last warble of the songbirds outside heralds the coming of dawn, we can drift off to sleep, our dreams untainted by the nightmarish specter of medieval cruelty and injustice. As the wretched criminal was led to the gallows, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. They had witnessed hangings before, but each one still carried a weight of grim finality. The condemned man, a thief and a brigand, had little sympathy from the onlookers. They saw his execution as a necessary cleansing, a removal of a rotten element from their society. The executioner, a hooded figure clad in black, stood impassively as the prisoner was brought before him. With practiced motions, he secured the noose around the man's neck, the rough hemp scratching against his skin. The thief's eyes darted wildly, searching for some last-minute reprieve, but none was forthcoming. At a nod from the local magistrate, the executioner pulled the lever. The trapdoor beneath the condemned man's feet swung open with a clatter, and he plunged downward. The rope snapped taut, and a sickening crack echoed across the square as his neck broke. His body twitched and danced, feet kicking at empty air before finally going limp. Justice, in the eyes of medieval society, had been served. Not all those who met the hangman's noose had their necks broken, however. In many cases, death by hanging was a slow and agonizing ordeal. The condemned would dangle, choking and gasping as the rope gradually cut off their air supply. This strangulation could take several long, excruciating minutes. It was a fate that befell a great many people during the Middle Ages, from common criminals to political dissidents. The gallows were a constant presence in medieval towns and villages, a grim reminder of the consequences of running afoul of the law. Yet even hanging, for all its brutal efficiency, was far from the worst fate that could befall those convicted of crimes in medieval Europe. For those who had committed particularly heinous acts, or who had aroused the ire of powerful people, even more gruesome punishments awaited. One such punishment was pressing. The condemned would be laid on the ground, and heavy stones or iron weights would be gradually piled upon their chests. The weight would slowly crush the victim, making each breath more difficult than the last, until eventually they suffocated under the immense pressure. This was the fate of Margaret Clitheroe, a woman living in 16th century England. Her crime was harboring Catholic priests, an act that had been outlawed as the country underwent the tumultuous religious changes of the Protestant Reformation. For her defiance, Margaret was sentenced to pressing. She endured this ordeal with remarkable courage, refusing to plead and thereby denying the authorities a formal trial. As the weights pressed down upon her, she is said to have whispered prayers until her last breath. Her martyrdom made her a symbol of faith and resistance for England's persecuted Catholics. While pressing was a terrible way to die, it paled in comparison to the agony of being burned at the stake. This punishment was often reserved for those convicted of heresy or witchcraft, crimes against the very soul of medieval society. The condemned would be tied to a wooden post, surrounded by bundles of firewood. As the flames were lit, they would quickly spread, consuming the dry tinder and licking at the victim's clothes and skin. The heat would become unbearable, the smoke thick and choking. Those burned at the stake would suffer an excruciating death, their screams echoing over the crackle of the flames. It was a slow and terrible way to die, often with crowds of onlookers watching the grisly spectacle. One of the most famous victims of burning was Joan of Arc, the young French peasant girl who claimed divine visions and led her country's armies against the English. Despite her successes on the battlefield, Joan was eventually captured and put on trial for heresy. The trial was a farce, more about politics than justice. Joan's refusal to submit to church authorities sealed her fate. She was sentenced to burn. As the flames consumed her, she clutched a crucifix and cried out the name of Jesus. Her ashes were scattered in the Seine to prevent her followers from collecting relics. Joan's story illustrates the capricious and often cynical nature of medieval justice. Those in power could use accusations of crimes like heresy to eliminate threats and consolidate their own positions. The horrific punishments they inflicted were as much about sending a message and enforcing control as they were about dispensing true justice. Perhaps the most infamous of all medieval execution methods was the grisly practice of hanging, drawing, and quartering. This was the ultimate punishment for high treason, a crime against the very foundations of the social order. The condemned traitor would first be dragged behind a horse to the place of execution, a symbolic act representing their loss of status and dignity. They would then be hanged until nearly dead, cut down before the life. Wallace was eventually captured and brought to London for trial. He refused to submit to English authority, denouncing the court and declaring his allegiance only to Scotland. For this defiance, he was sentenced to the traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Contemporary accounts describe the awful scene in grim detail. Wallace remained stalwart to the end, enduring each awful stage of his execution with remarkable courage until the final blow of the axe ended his suffering. His body was dismembered, and his head was mounted on London Bridge as a warning to other would-be rebels. But rather than quell the Scottish resistance, Wallace's martyrdom only served to inspire further rebellion. His grisly death became a rallying cry, a symbol of the cruelty of English oppression and the unyielding spirit of Scottish independence. As we reflect on these dark chapters of history, it's easy to feel a sense of horror and revulsion. The cruelty and brutality of medieval justice can seem almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. It's important to remember, however, that these practices didn't end with the Middle Ages. Many of these gruesome punishments continued well into the early modern period, and echoes of them can still be seen in some parts of the world today. Yet we can also take heart in the progress that has been made over the centuries. As societies have evolved and values have shifted, many of the most brutal practices of medieval justice have been abolished. The rise of Enlightenment ideals, the growth of democratic institutions, and the recognition of universal human rights have all contributed to a gradual civilizing of the justice system. Today, in much of the world, the focus of justice has shifted from retribution and deterrence to rehabilitation and restoration. While the system is far from perfect and injustices still occur, we have come a long way from the dark days of the medieval dungeon and the public scaffold as we drift off to sleep. We can be grateful for the relative peace and security that we enjoy in the modern world. The horrors of history, while important to remember and learn from, need not haunt our dreams. Instead, we can rest easy, secure in the knowledge that we live in a time of greater justice, greater compassion, and greater hope for a brighter future. And with that thought, dear listener, I bid you good night. May your dreams be filled not with the dark shadows of the past, but with the warm light of a better tomorrow. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, be sure to like and subscribe. There are many more tales to tell, and I look forward to sharing them with you. Until next time, sleep well.